Hello and welcome back to our summer series of Technically Speaking, during which we'll be focusing on decisions you can make and levers you can pull to make sure the performance of your application is as fast as possible while balancing the needs of your project. Over the past 6 weeks, we've been looking at topics from RBAC to workflow to modularity, and today we're talking about screen rendering. I'm very excited to welcome Brad Kelly to the show to discuss considerations for screen rendering and performance and what the decisions and keystones are when you're designing that. Brad, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to share, my findings on screen rendering. And just to introduce myself, I've been with Uncork for about 3 years, coming up on 3 years in September. I've been an application engineer the entire time, so I know my way around Uncork, and I've spent plenty of time on screen rendering. So very excited to speak about that today.
Amazing. And let's start just to make sure everyone's on the same page. What do we mean when we talk about screen rendering?
So when we're talking about screen rendering, it's the loading time of the UI and all of its associated data and behavior. So, that could be on page load, or if we have specific pieces of the application that have to, change dynamically throughout user interactions, rendering new components on the page, that sort of thing. So it's just ensuring that, we have all the data, all of the UI inputs, and all of the behavior loaded.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And what are our options when we talk about screen rendering? I think a lot of people think of it as out of the box when we
Mhm.
talk about Uncork. What are our options when we get to decide what to do?
So there are three options. We have the client-side rendering, server-side rendering, and then a combination of both, which we like to call hybrid. So there's many different use cases that apply to each. So client-side would include, you've kind of predefined an Uncork module, and you're just, navigating to that and, allowing Uncork to just render that straight away. Server side includes, you would create components or fetch components on the server side of Uncork and send them and fetch them from the client side and load those through like an API call to the Uncork server side. And the third one would be a combination of what I've mentioned previously. So, for an example, you might have a header, a navigation bar, and a footer that are always static, and the content between those items would be dynamic. And so that's kind of most of the use cases would be a hybrid use case where not the entire screen is dynamic, but only a portion of it.
Amazing. And the client side piece of this is, I think, what most people are familiar
Mhm.
with. They build a module, they hit preview, they see it in their browser. When it comes to implementing the server side, how does one go about doing that implementation?
Mhm. Yeah, so about this time last year, we implemented a new feature at Uncore called Dynamic Refresh, which allows us to dynamically load components onto the UI client side. So we would use a dynamic refresh panel. And so the way we would implement that is we need to create the components that are going to be rendered in the dynamic refresh panel. So that might be done through fetching a module's components with the Uncork endpoint fetch components, or if you have some UI that you'd like to render that's coming from an external source like an API, you can use that as well and convert that data that's sent from an external API into Uncork JSON and then dynamically load it into that dynamic refresh panel. So that's one of the features that has been extremely important for improving rendering times on the client side.
Yeah, it seems like by being able to dynamically pull those things in, you could get a huge performance improvement if it's the right use case to do so. And with that, you know, what are the pros other than the performance that I just mentioned? It sounds like
Mhm,
there could be a client side as well as server side. Maybe start
mhm.
with the client side that we're all familiar with.
Yeah, of course. So client side would, include some of the pros there are, if you have simple logic for reflexive or dynamic UI. So, if you answer a question yes, there's two more fields that might appear that you have to answer. If you answer yes or if you answer no, um, you show a different set of fields. And so this can be accomplished through using rules in Uncork. Um, so that is kind of some of the pros there. This also reduces um, the load on the server because the end user's computer is rendering all of that information. And this would reduce like network traffic. So it would require less API calls made to the Uncork server side or to an external API to fetch that data there. So
Okay. And then for the hybrid, are there any pros to kind of doing both of these together?
yeah, so the pros for a hybrid approach would be, you have a set of, sections on a page that are static. And if you want a subsection that is dynamic, that is its best use case. So some of the pros there would be, you're able to dynamically load certain sections on the page based off of user interaction or data that's served in the or saved in the application. So that would allow for a single page application, let's say, and you're not loading the uh, all the different sections at once. You're just loading one section at a time. So the page loading time would be more performant because you're only fetching what you need at that moment in time.
Amazing. And are there rules of thumb when we're looking at which use case to use when?
Yeah, so I would say for client side, this is best suited for a less complex set of rules for the given UI, as well as a little bit more complex UI UX requirements because dynamic refresh, if you're dynamically generating component JSON, it's a little bit difficult to apply the correct styles or create the component definitions that you're looking for. So if you have those complex requirements, it's kind of better to do client side as well as the performance isn't as much of an issue as if you were to implement server side or hybrid. So yeah.
Okay. And for server side, any rules of thumb that we should be making sure that we implement?
Yeah. So for server side, if you have a set of components that are all or a section of the page that has many permutations, that is kind of best suited for server side. If your page load time is a priority, you would want to focus on doing a server side rendering. So, the components are served up quickly and as well as, you can fetch field data on from the server side multiple times throughout the user interaction without having to actually reload the entire page. So the static sections would remain the same, but the dynamic sections, like using a dynamic refresh panel, would consistently load different items based off of user input. Um, as well as if you want to implement server side, I would say some of the rules of thumb there would be um, if your field level data is coming from an external source like an API, and you would be converting the JSON that comes in from the external source into uncorked JSON and loading that as well. So if you have a use case where you have a set of fields. And as the user answers questions, there might be additional fields that are required. And if all of those rules live on the external API source, you'd have to go back and forth between the external source and Uncork in order to load the new questions that might come up depending on the user's answers. So that would be something that's very difficult to implement on the client side. Whereas if you're letting the API, the external API, do all the rules and saving of the data for the calculations, then that's kind of why we would use server side there. So another reason to go with server side would be that the UI changes frequently and has many different permutations based off of user input or application data.
Yeah, makes total sense. And obviously, then our hybrid is rules of thumb of both, right? We're going to put both of those into one module and use the particular rules of thumb that you just went over. Any other thoughts on rendering and how we should think about it as we go through Uncork for performance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say, some of the general use cases I've seen for hybrid would be like a single page application with a static navigation header and footer, but the content within the page is changing frequently. And the benefit of that is to all of you're not loading the entire definition of a module at once. You're just loading pieces of it, depending on what the user has inputted. And I would say, that's kind of where most of the use cases fall for dynamic refresh is, you're only doing a small portion of the page. So you can really improve load times doing that because, it's just a lot less data that you're loading on the page.
That's great. I think there were some great thoughts in here today about how we render, one of the biggest parts of many of our applications, and how to improve performance through that. I want to thank Brad for joining us and for helping us all understand, server side, client side, and hybrid rendering for our projects.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great sharing my thoughts here. So hopefully I help a few people understand screen rendering in Uncork.
Thanks again, Brad.
Awesome. Thank you so much.